The Great Plague of London, an event that redefined the city's history. But what if I told you that the story we know, the horrors we imagine, might only be the surface of something much darker, something still lingering in the shadows of time? Keep listening as we peel back the layers of fear, survival, and the inexplicable mysteries surrounding the deadliest outbreak the city has ever seen. They called it the Year of Death. In 1665, London was gripped by something far more fearsome than fire, war, or famine. It was a disease, relentless and unforgiving, spreading through the city like a whisper in the night, leaving devastation in its wake. But here's the question we should all be asking. Was it merely nature's fury, or was there something more sinister at play? The city was no stranger to sickness. Before the Great Plague, smaller outbreaks had swept through the streets, but they were manageable. Nothing like what was to come. Imagine walking through a crowded market, the hum of life surrounding you. Just days later, half the people you'd brushed past could be dead. Entire families would vanish in days, leaving homes abandoned, sealed shut with painted crosses that marked them as cursed. Yet the origins of this devastating plague are shrouded in mystery. Historians will tell you it was the fleas on rats, a simple explanation for such overwhelming loss. But what if there was more to it than that? What if London's squalid conditions, the overcrowding and the unsanitary living standards weren't the only factors that led to the demise of thousands? As we delve deeper, we uncover stories, testimonies from those who lived through the chaos that suggest the plague was not just a matter of fleas or rats. In some cases, people with no contact with the infected would fall ill. Could there have been an unknown element to the spread? A form of contagion we still don't fully understand today. The spread was terrifying in its speed and efficiency. Houses were boarded up. Entire streets turned into ghostly remnants of a city that was, just weeks before, teeming with life. But there was another layer to the plague that was less tangible. An eerie sense of foreboding that fell over the city, as though London itself had become a living entity, consumed by death. But where exactly did it all start? Who was the first victim, and could they have known the chain of events they would set in motion? Here's where things get interesting. This isn't just a tale of disease, but a mystery that has puzzled scholars and survivors alike for centuries. In some parts of the city, whispers spoke of strange occurrences before the outbreak. Unexplained phenomena, sightings of figures draped in black cloaks moving through the streets at night, their faces never revealed. Some say they were plague doctors, doing their grim work of treating the sick, but others, those more attuned to superstition, believed they were something far more ominous, harbingers of the plague, sent to curse the city before the first symptoms even appeared. Could it be possible? Is it madness to consider that forces beyond human comprehension might have had a role in this tragedy? And then there were the disappearances. Stories emerged of people entirely healthy, vanishing from their homes. Neighbors would wake to find empty houses, the windows open, curtains fluttering in the breeze, with no trace of the families that lived there. Some were discovered later, their bodies found far from the city, as if they had fled something more frightening than disease. Could the fear of contagion have driven them mad? Or was there a darker reason for these disappearances? Let's pause here for a moment and reflect. How would you feel, living in a city where death roamed free and the very air you breathed felt poisoned? Could you survive the overwhelming paranoia, the creeping suspicion that anyone around you could be next? And more disturbingly, could the person next to you be the one responsible for spreading the plague? The official records tell us that nearly 100,000 people perished, but that's just what was documented. Could there have been more? The silence of the time, the deliberate absence of certain testimonies, suggests we may never know the true extent of the loss. Hospitals overflowed with the dead and dying, but there were also those who avoided the official routes, people taken from their homes in the dead of night, their bodies never recorded in the city's tallies. These people didn't just die, they disappeared without a trace, leaving behind questions that remain unanswered. But if you thought that was the end of the mystery, think again. As we continue, we'll delve deeper into the personal stories of those who managed to survive, only to be haunted by the memories of what they witnessed. What do their accounts reveal that the history books leave out? And most chilling of all, why do some claim that the Great Plague never truly ended? That its legacy continues to linger beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to rise again? And this is just the first part of a much larger journey into the heart of one of the most terrifying events in human history. Stay with me as we unravel the dark secrets of the Great Plague, because trust me, the most shocking revelations are yet to come. But where did it all begin? The plague didn't start in London. It crept in like a silent storm, crossing borders, coming from lands far away. The air was already thick with anxiety from previous outbreaks across Europe, and yet, as 1665 dawned, most Londoners were unaware of the dark cloud gathering on the horizon. What was happening outside the city should have been a warning. Ships arriving from ports across the continent carried more than just goods. They brought the plague with them. The cargo holds, filled with grain, cloth, and other necessities, also housed the infected rats, whose fleas carried the deadly bacteria. But imagine this: a city thriving on trade, dependent on its ships for survival. Could the officials really afford to shut down their harbors? Or were they driven by a blind arrogance, a belief that they could outrun the inevitable? Let me take you to a small parish in St. Giles, Westminster, where the first official cases were reported. A family living in squalor struck down by the mysterious sickness. Their neighbors looked on with a mix of pity and fear, unaware that this family would be the first of thousands. Word spread quickly, fear even faster, but action was slow. As the summer months approached, the city became a breeding ground for disaster. The conditions were perfect. The filth in the streets, the overcrowded homes, the lack of basic sanitation. It was as though London itself had become a petri dish for death. But what if this outbreak could have been prevented? As you listen, ask yourself, how could a city so powerful, so advanced in many ways, allow itself to fall victim to something so seemingly avoidable? The streets of London were soon filled with carts, not of produce or goods, but of bodies. The dead carts became a haunting feature of daily life. The creaking of their wooden wheels a grim reminder of the city's descent into chaos. And what about those in power? The king and his court fled to Oxford, leaving the city to fend for itself. With them went the hope of leadership, the confidence that anyone could save London from its grim fate. The wealthy followed suit, escaping to their country estates, leaving the poor and the vulnerable behind. Imagine the hopelessness of those left within the city walls, abandoned, forsaken. Do you think they felt like they had been condemned? Or did they hold on to some desperate hope that the plague would pass them by? The streets, once lively with the bustle of trade and conversation, became eerily silent. The few who remained outdoors avoided each other like shadows, no longer greeting their neighbors with the warmth of familiarity. Even friends and family kept their distance. Could you blame them? How could you trust anyone when the very breath they exhaled might carry death? Yet, there were those who refused to believe it was all just the result of a natural disaster. Darker theories began to surface. Some whispered of divine punishment, that this was the wrath of God, punishing the sinful city for its greed and corruption. Others claimed the plague was man-made, a curse placed upon London by foreign enemies or witches looking to destroy the heart of England. These beliefs only fueled the fear, leading to witch hunts and accusations that mirrored the terror of the disease itself. Can you imagine the chaos, where the real threat, the plague, was compounded by the hysteria of an unseen enemy? And then, there were those who took advantage of the situation. The ones who profited from the fear and death. Gravediggers, plague doctors, even the sellers of so-called miracle cures. Some of these individuals seemed almost too eager for the plague to continue, lining their pockets as the bodies piled up. But could it be possible that some of them knew more than they let on? Were they simply opportunists, or was there a darker force driving their actions, something that went beyond mere human greed? What came next would change the city forever. Yet at this moment, the citizens of London were still holding their breath, waiting for the storm to pass. Little did they know the worst was yet to come. Let's pause for a moment. What would you have done if you lived in this nightmare? Would you flee as the wealthy did? Would you take your chances, hoping the sickness would skip over your household? Or would you succumb to the growing hysteria, believing that something far more sinister than disease was at play? But if you think that the story so far is terrifying, wait until you hear what happened next. As the summer heat intensified, so did the suffering. The plague raged through the narrow, stinking streets of London, sparing no one. rich or poor, young or old. Everyone was at risk. By mid-June, the death toll had soared, and yet it was only the beginning. But here's the part that will make you wonder. Among the chaos, there were areas within the city that remained untouched. Streets that, for reasons still debated to this day, saw few to no cases. Why? Was it pure luck? Or something else? Something that defies explanation? Let's dive deeper into this mystery. In the midst of overwhelming death, there were pockets of life that thrived. St. James's Parish, located just a short walk from the hardest-hit areas, saw remarkably fewer casualties. This wasn't due to any obvious measures. There were no special quarantines, no advanced medical knowledge that would explain the difference. Some say it was the cleaner water supply in the area, but others believed the residents had made a pact, an unholy agreement to protect themselves from the death that stalked their neighbors. This is where superstition begins to merge with fact, where the lines blur. Could something as abstract as faith or fear create such a stark contrast in survival? And then there were the lucky few who claimed to have special remedies or protections against the plague. The plague doctors, with their long beak-like masks filled with aromatic herbs, believed they could avoid infection simply by purifying the air around them. Their appearance alone was enough to strike fear into the hearts of those they treated. Imagine the scene: a doctor, dressed in black, face hidden behind a grotesque mask, arriving at the door of a dying patient. Did the mere sight of them offer comfort or dread? But here's where things take an even darker turn. Some of these doctors, it seems, were not just treating the sick, they were spreading the disease. Testimonies from survivors suggest that a few of these so-called healers were agents of death themselves, possibly driven by madness or greed. Were they experimenting on their patients, testing unorthodox treatments that only hastened death? Or worse, were they intentionally infecting those they were meant to save, profiting from the increased demand for their services? One case in particular stands out: the story of a man named Dr. Colburn. He was a respected physician, well known in the city for his miraculous cures. But as the death toll in his area rose, rumors began to circulate. Survivors from the houses he visited claimed that after his treatments, their loved ones died faster than before. One chilling report describes a young mother suffering from the first symptoms who allowed Dr. Colburn to treat her. The next morning, her family found her dead, her body displaying signs of advanced plague that should have taken days to develop. Was it simply the nature of the disease, or was there something more sinister at play? As the weeks dragged on, London became a city of the dead. The living barricaded themselves in their homes, while outside, the streets echoed with the sounds of death, the cries of the sick, the shuffle of feet as corpses were dragged to mass graves. By late July, the plague had reached its peak, and the city's resources were stretched beyond breaking point. Bodies piled up in the streets, and the gravediggers could no longer keep up with the demand. Whole families were wiped out in a matter of days, their homes sealed with the ominous red crosses that marked them as infected. But amidst this horror, something curious was happening. Certain people, those who were constantly exposed to the plague, seemed immune. Gravediggers, caretakers, and even a few doctors walked among the infected without falling ill. They handled the dead, entered infected homes, and breathed the same air, yet they lived. How could this be? Were they truly immune, or had they somehow avoided exposure through some unknown means? Was it luck, or something more? There's an account of a gravedigger named John Law, who worked tirelessly throughout the outbreak, moving hundreds of bodies to the burial pits. His job should have been a death sentence, yet he never showed a single symptom. When asked how he avoided infection, he simply shrugged and said, "The Lord watches over me." But this explanation wasn't enough for some. Rumors began to spread that Law had made a deal with the devil, that his immunity was unnatural, a dark blessing in exchange for his soul. Whether it was divine intervention or something more sinister, no one can say for sure, but Law continued his grim work, untouched by the disease that claimed everyone around him. And then there were the burial pits themselves. Imagine walking past them, great yawning holes in the ground filled to the brim with bodies. The smell alone was enough to make people faint. These pits were hastily dug, often without regard for the proper care of the deceased. It was as though the dead were being swallowed by the earth itself, lost to history, forgotten. But there were whispers, always whispers. that these pits were more than just graves. Some said they could hear strange noises at night, groans and cries, not from the living but from the dead themselves. Was it merely the ravings of a city driven mad by grief and fear, or could something far darker have taken root in the city of London? As August approached, the plague showed no sign of slowing, and yet something even more chilling was about to occur, an event that would make London question everything it knew about death, disease, and the thin line that separates the living from the dead. You see, by now we've uncovered some of the most horrific and puzzling aspects of this tragic period. But we're not done yet. The most disturbing secrets of the Great Plague are still ahead. What if I told you that some of the people marked as dead, sealed away in their homes or thrown into the pits, were not actually dead at all? That's right. People buried alive. But how could that happen? And what happened to those who managed to escape? As the plague swept through London, fear did more than infect the mind. It clouded judgment. In the frantic rush to remove the dead from the streets, corners were cut, precautions overlooked. The truth, unsettling as it may seem, is that many who were thought to be dead were simply unconscious or in a state so weakened by the disease that their shallow breathing was mistaken for death. Imagine it, a loved one, pale, still, feverish but not yet dead, being carried away to the burial pits, their body destined to be entombed alongside the truly deceased. But it gets worse. Testimonies from this time describe horrifying incidents where, days later, faint cries were heard from beneath the earth. Gravediggers reported strange sounds, scratching, muffled screams, coming from the mass graves. At first, it was dismissed as the creaking of wooden boards or the wind, but as the cries grew more desperate, it became harder to ignore. The thought that someone could wake up entombed beneath layers of dirt, suffocating, helpless, was almost too much to bear. This brings us to one of the most chilling aspects of the Great Plague, premature burial. For some, the fear of being buried alive became almost as terrifying as the plague itself. There are records of families taking extreme measures to ensure their loved ones were truly dead before burial. Some would wait days, even weeks, before allowing bodies to be taken away, just to make sure. In other cases, bodies were tied to bells, small strings wrapped around the wrists of the deceased, attached to a bell above the grave. If the buried person moved, the bell would ring, a final cry for help from the other side. This is where the term "saved by the bell" may have originated, a grim reminder of how close people came to being lost forever in the cold ground. But did it actually work? Were people really saved by these methods, or was it too late by the time the bell rang? There are documented cases of survivors, people who were mistakenly taken for dead but managed to claw their way back to the land of the living. One such story is that of Mary Edwards, a woman from the outskirts of London who was believed to have succumbed to the plague. Her family, grief-stricken and overwhelmed, allowed her body to be taken to a mass burial site. It wasn't until the gravedigger noticed her hand twitch that he realized she was still alive. Pulled from the brink of death, she recovered and lived to tell the tale. But what of those who weren't so lucky? For every Mary Edwards, how many others lay buried in silence, their stories lost to the earth? As you think about these stories, ask yourself, how could such a mistake be made? How could they have let this happen? Was it carelessness, a rush to rid the city of the dead, or was there something more? A deeper, almost deliberate negligence, driven by fear and survival instincts? What if the authorities, overwhelmed by the sheer number of deaths, decided it was easier to bury the living along with the dead than to risk further outbreaks? The deeper we go, the more it becomes clear that London, during the Great Plague, was a city not just battling disease but fighting against itself. A place where the line between life and death blurred so completely that even the living weren't safe from the grave. But let's not forget the strange occurrences reported by the gravediggers. There are accounts of eerie phenomena at the burial pits. Some said they saw figures walking among the graves at night, shadowy forms that seemed to be neither fully human nor spirit. These figures would appear after dark, moving silently through the fog, only to disappear by morning. Who or what were they? Were they hallucinations brought on by exhaustion and grief? Or were they something else, something tied to the plague, to death itself? Some survivors claimed these apparitions were the souls of those buried alive, wandering the earth in search of justice. Others believed they were omens, signs that the plague was far from over. And then there were those who thought these figures were harbingers, entities sent to collect the souls of those who were about to die. One chilling account comes from a gravedigger named Thomas Kent, who swore he saw a figure in a long black cloak standing by one of the burial pits late at night. He approached the figure, assuming it was a mourner, but as he got closer, the figure vanished into thin air. Shaken, Kent later discovered that several people from the nearby street had died of the plague that very night. Was it a coincidence, or did he witness something far more ominous? The deeper we delve into the events surrounding the Great Plague, the more it seems like the city itself was haunted, not just by disease, but by the specter of death that hung over every street, every home, every grave. But the plague did more than just kill. It drove people to madness. Desperation gave rise to strange beliefs and practices. Some citizens, convinced that they could ward off the disease through supernatural means, turned to dark rituals. A secret society known as the Order of the Black Feather began to emerge in the city, claiming they had found a way to protect themselves from the plague. They wore black feathers as talismans, believing the feathers had magical properties that could repel death. The society grew rapidly as fear-stricken citizens flocked to their cause, paying exorbitant amounts for these so-called protections. But here's where things take a strange turn. Despite the widespread death around them, many members of the Order survived. Did they possess some hidden knowledge, or was it all a coincidence? One theory suggests that the Order may have been using a form of early vaccination, though rudimentary and dangerous by modern standards. They claim to have discovered a way to inoculate themselves against the plague by exposing themselves to small, controlled amounts of the disease. If this is true, it would make the Order one of the earliest practitioners of inoculation, a practice that wouldn't be officially recognized for another century. But here's the question: did they really possess this knowledge, or was it luck? Or worse, was there something darker, something unnatural at play? Were they surviving because of the talismans, or because of the deals they made in the shadows? As the plague raged on, it wasn't just the disease that was killing people. It was fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of the inevitable, fear of those strange figures that walked the night. And in the middle of all this, the Order thrived, growing more powerful as the death toll rose. But the price of survival wasn't always worth it. Some members of the Order began to vanish, their homes found empty, their whereabouts unknown. Did they flee, or were they taken by the very forces they sought to control? But here's where it gets even stranger. After the plague subsided, the Order of the Black Feather vanished entirely. There's no record of them after 1666. Some say they disbanded, their purpose fulfilled. Others believe they were hunted down by the authorities, who feared their growing influence. But there's one final theory: that the Order never truly disappeared. They simply went underground, their descendants still walking among us, passing down their dark knowledge from generation to generation. And so, we are left with more questions than answers. What truly caused the plague? Was it merely the result of unsanitary conditions and poor hygiene, or was there something more? A curse, a malevolent force that swept through the city, leaving only destruction in its wake? Could there still be remnants of that dark time, lurking in the forgotten corners of London, waiting to resurface? The deeper we go, the more chilling the story becomes. But this isn't the end. There are still darker secrets to uncover, more mysteries that have never been fully explained. What happened to those who survived? What strange phenomena occurred after the plague finally loosened its grip on the city? As the Great Plague began to loosen its stranglehold on London, an eerie calm settled over the city. By September, the number of deaths had started to decrease, though the streets remained deathly silent, save for the occasional cart carrying bodies to the remaining burial pits. People began to emerge from their homes, cautiously at first, but with a growing sense of hope. But that hope, as fragile as it was, came with a strange, lingering fear. Because while the plague itself was receding, something else had taken root, something far darker and far less understood. Imagine the scene: a once bustling city reduced to a ghost town, windows and doors still boarded up, red crosses painted on countless homes, and the smell of death lingering in the air. Those who survived carried not only the scars of illness, but also the trauma of what they had witnessed. Family members ripped away, buried alive, mysterious figures haunting the night. And as they tried to piece their lives back together, rumors began to spread about what had really happened during the height of the plague. This is where the story takes an unexpected turn. While the official narrative focused on the disease, the rats, the fleas, the unsanitary conditions, there were those who believed something more sinister had been at play. A group of survivors, calling themselves the Silent Ones, began to speak out, claiming that they had encountered forces beyond the natural world. They believed that the plague was not just a biological catastrophe, but a spiritual one, a curse unleashed upon the city by something ancient and malevolent. The Silent Ones were not just ordinary citizens. Many of them were people who had experienced the most bizarre and inexplicable events during the plague. Instances of supernatural occurrences, encounters with entities they could not explain. One such figure was a woman named Sarah Brightman, a widow who had lost her entire family to the plague. Yet despite being in the thick of the contagion, Sarah never contracted the disease. Instead, she claimed to have seen visions, figures cloaked in black, standing at the edge of the burial pits, whispering to her as she walked the streets. These figures, she said, were not human, nor were they spirits of the dead. They were something older, darker, and far more dangerous. But here's where it gets even stranger. Sarah wasn't the only one. Several other survivors, all from different parts of London, reported seeing the same figures. Shadowy entities that appeared at night, always near the burial sites or plague houses. Some described them as wearing long black robes, while others swore they had no faces at all. One survivor, a young man named Thomas Bell, recounted how he saw one of these figures standing in the doorway of his neighbor's house, just hours before the entire family succumbed to the disease. He believed that the figure was a harbinger, a bringer of death. But was this just the product of feverish minds, or was there something more at work? The Silent Ones believed they had the answer. According to them, the plague was not merely a natural disaster, but a form of punishment, brought upon by the forgotten spirits of London's past. They pointed to the city's history of violence, corruption, and greed, suggesting that these shadowy figures were ancient guardians sent to cleanse the city of its sins. It's a chilling thought, isn't it? That the plague, with all its horror and devastation, could have been a deliberate act, one that went far beyond human understanding. And it wasn't just the Silent Ones who believed this. As the plague receded, strange reports continued to emerge from different parts of London. There were stories of doors opening on their own, of whispers carried on the wind, of cold, unnatural chills sweeping through homes that had been touched by death. One of the most unsettling reports came from a small church near Bishopsgate. The priest, Father Daniel, claimed that during a late-night vigil for the dead, he saw the figure of a young girl standing at the back of the church. She was pale, dressed in white, and though her lips did not move, Father Daniel swore he could hear her whispering. When he approached her, she vanished. The next morning, the church groundskeeper found a small, child-sized grave just outside the churchyard, one that had not been there the day before. But what could these phenomena mean? Were they signs of lingering spirits, trapped in the liminal space between life and death? Or were they something far darker, something that had been awakened by the mass deaths, feeding off the fear and despair of the living? As much as we might want to explain these events away as hallucinations or the result of trauma, there's an undeniable pattern to the accounts. Too many people from too many different parts of the city reported seeing the same figures, hearing the same whispers. There's one particularly chilling account that stands out. It comes from a man named Edward Cooper, a former gravedigger who worked tirelessly through the worst of the plague. Edward claimed that one night, while digging a new burial pit near Moorfields, he heard voices. At first he thought it was the wind, but as he dug deeper, the voices grew louder. They were speaking in a language he didn't understand, harsh, guttural, like nothing he had ever heard before. And then, just as he was about to stop digging, his shovel struck something hard. He bent down to see what it was, expecting to find a rock or a tree root, but instead he uncovered a small black stone. It was smooth, polished, and cold to the touch, despite the summer heat. Edward didn't think much of it at the time, but later that night he began to feel ill. He described a sensation of being watched, as though something was following him, lurking just beyond his field of vision. Over the next few days, he became increasingly paranoid, convinced that the black stone he had found was cursed. He tried to throw it away, but no matter where he left it, whether in the river or buried deep in the ground, it always found its way back to him. Eventually, Edward disappeared, leaving only a hastily scrawled note behind. The shadows know. They are coming for me. His disappearance was never solved. Some believe he fled the city, driven mad by the trauma of what he had witnessed. Others think the shadows he spoke of were real, and that they claimed him just as they had claimed so many others. The black stone he found. It was never recovered. So where does this leave us? By the time the plague finally loosened its grip on London, the city was left with more questions than answers. Yes, the death toll had dropped, and the streets were slowly coming back to life, but the scars remained. And more than that, the sense that something had shifted, that London itself had changed, forever altered by the events of 1665. Even today, there are those who believe that the true nature of the Great Plague was never fully understood. That beneath the surface of disease and death, there was something far darker at work. Something that still lingers, waiting, watching, in the forgotten corners of the city. So what do you think? Was the plague simply a tragic consequence of human ignorance and poor hygiene, or was there something more, something that defies explanation? As we come to the end of this chapter, the final question remains: could it happen again? And remember, the darkest secrets are often the ones left unsolved. As London slowly crawled back to life, the survivors faced a new reality. The plague had killed tens of thousands, leaving behind a city forever scarred by its horrors. Streets once filled with the sounds of merchants and laughter were now eerily quiet, and in the lingering silence, strange occurrences continued to unsettle the populace. The disease may have loosened its grip, but the terror that came with it seemed far from over. Survivors began to tell stories of seeing strange figures in the mist at dusk, walking the deserted streets. Some described these figures as being cloaked in shadows, moving silently, almost as if they weren't truly there. One such account came from Elizabeth Gray, a seamstress who had lived through the worst days of the outbreak. She claimed to have seen one of these shadowy figures standing at the foot of her bed one night, watching her with hollow eyes. It didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there waiting. The next morning, she awoke to find a black feather on her pillow. Others reported similar encounters, and a strange feeling began to settle over the city, as though something still watched from the shadows. But perhaps the most chilling story to emerge after the plague's decline was that of the night walkers. As more people began to venture out after months of isolation, whispers spread about a group of individuals who only appeared after sundown. These people, described as pale, gaunt, and always cloaked in black, would be seen wandering through the streets, seemingly unaffected by the disease. They spoke to no one, made no noise, and disappeared before dawn. Their origins were a mystery, but soon rumors began to spread that these night walkers were not human. Some believed they were the spirits of those who had been buried alive, cursed to walk the earth forever. Others thought they were members of the long-vanished Order of the Black Feather, somehow surviving the plague by making dark pacts with forces beyond human understanding. A particularly disturbing account came from a baker named William Harrow. He had lost his entire family to the plague, but he survived, having barricaded himself inside his home for months. One night he decided to venture out, desperate to see if any of his neighbors had survived. As he walked through the empty streets, he noticed a figure ahead of him, shrouded in black, standing perfectly still. Thinking it was another survivor, William called out to them, but the figure didn't respond. Instead, it turned and began to walk away, disappearing around the corner of a narrow alley. Curious and a little desperate for human contact, William followed. When he reached the corner, the figure was gone. But as he stood there looking into the dark alleyway, he felt a cold hand on his shoulder. He spun around, only to find no one there. Shaken, he hurried back home, only to fall ill the next morning. William's fever raged for days, and he was convinced that whatever had touched him in the alley had cursed him. Though he eventually recovered, he refused to leave his house again, terrified of what he had encountered that night. But the story doesn't end there. As time passed, more and more survivors began to report seeing these strange figures. Some claimed they could hear faint whispers in the night, voices speaking in a language they couldn't understand. Others felt a sense of dread whenever they passed by the old plague pits, as if something was watching them from below. The night walkers, as they came to be known, seemed to be drawn to these burial sites. People who ventured too close at night would often hear soft footsteps behind them, only to turn and find no one there. Over time, the idea of walking the streets alone after dark became unthinkable. It was as if the city had developed a second curfew, one not enforced by law but by fear. And yet, despite the growing unease, there were still those who dismissed these stories as the ramblings of traumatized survivors, their minds warped by grief and isolation. But there was one last case that couldn't be so easily explained away. In the summer of 1667, 2 years after the worst of the plague, a group of children playing near an old burial ground in Clerkenwell made a chilling discovery. While digging in the dirt, they uncovered a small, intricately carved wooden box. Inside was a bundle of old, decaying letters, each written in a spidery hand. The letters, dated to 1665, appeared to be from a man named James Hawthorne, a physician who had been working in the city during the height of the outbreak. But as the children continued to read, they realized that these were no ordinary letters. In them, Hawthorne described strange encounters he had experienced during the plague, patients who, though seemingly dead, would suddenly sit up and begin to speak in tongues. Others who claimed to see dark, faceless figures standing at the edges of their vision, just waiting. The letters grew more frantic as Hawthorne detailed his own descent into madness. He wrote of hearing voices in the night, calling his name, and of finding black feathers left on his doorstep every morning. In his final letter, dated September 1665, Hawthorne wrote, "They have come for me. I hear them outside my door now. I am not afraid of death, but I fear what comes after. May God have mercy on my soul." The children's discovery reignited old fears, and soon the story of James Hawthorne spread like wildfire through the city. People began to wonder if the plague had been something more than a disease, if it had truly been a punishment from beyond, one that had left behind dark, malevolent forces that still lingered in the shadows. The night walkers became the stuff of legend, but there were those who claimed to have seen them even years after the last cases of the plague had disappeared. One such account came from a soldier who had returned from the wars abroad. He described walking through London late at night, only to feel the distinct sensation of being followed. When he turned around, he saw a group of figures, pale and cloaked in black, standing in the distance watching him. They made no move to approach, but their presence filled him with an overwhelming sense of dread. He quickened his pace, not daring to look back until he was safely inside his home. So, what are we left with? Was the Great Plague of London merely a tragic event, a natural disaster that claimed thousands of lives? Or was there something more? Something darker that still clings to the city's bones? The accounts of the night walkers, the shadowy figures, the strange disappearances. Are they the product of overactive imaginations, or do they point to a deeper, more sinister truth? As we stand here, centuries removed from the events of 1665, we must ask ourselves, what if the plague wasn't just a biological catastrophe? What if it was something far more supernatural, a curse that London has never truly escaped? And here's the final question, one that might haunt you long after this story ends. What if they're still here? I'll leave you with this thought. London is an ancient city, with centuries of history buried beneath its streets. And sometimes the past doesn't stay buried. If you ever find yourself walking alone through the darkened streets of London, and you feel that unsettling sensation of being watched, don't dismiss it. The night walkers may be closer than you think. This brings us to the conclusion of our tale. But remember, as with all mysteries, the true story may never be fully told. If this story has left you with questions, or perhaps with chills, I encourage you to share your thoughts, your theories. After all, history is often shaped by those who dare to question it, and perhaps, somewhere out there, the truth is still waiting to be uncovered.